So we think there are at least 3 isoforms of cyclooxygenase, 1, 2, and 3. And so, as we've already seen, these enzymes are present throughout the body. And in particular, the COX-1 is present everywhere. And when we were talking about the production of mucus in the stomach, so it's COX-1 that's responsible for the production of mucus in the stomach. So many of the housekeeping functions of prostaglandins are carried out by the synthesis of prostaglandin via COX-1. In contrast, COX-2 is only induced upon inflammation. So if you have arthritis, the inflammatory process is increasing the transcription of the gene for COX-2. It means you produce much more COX-2, so you then produce much more prostaglandins. So if you've got an arthritic elbow, for example, or a tennis elbow, then you, in that inflammation, you're producing more COX-2, and because you've got more COX-2, you're making more prostaglandin, and so you've got more prostaglandin around, you're sensitizing your pain enzymes more, and you're doing all of those inflammatory things that we talked about in the last lecture. And then you have COX-3 in the brain, and as I explained, I think in the seminar, we think that might be responsible for the action of paracetamol in the hypothalamus, in the regulation of fever and temperature. But that was like just a theory. So if you think about this information, and you realize that aspirin is not selective for the COX isoforms. Okay, so aspirin inhibits COX-1 and COX-2 and we think COX-3. How would you design a better drug? How could you improve upon aspirin if you're wanting to treat the pain relating to inflammation?
Have it only inhibit COX-2?
Exactly. So as soon as the isoforms of cyclooxygenase were identified, there was a massive effort from a lot of drug companies all at once in order to try and find COX-2 selective inhibitors, because they were going to be the bee's knees. They were going to be the most wonderful thing, because then you could treat the inflammation and the pain related to inflammation without getting a stomach ulcer, without having bleeding in the stomach, which would be a fantastic thing to be able to do. Can you see by my tone of voice, which would be a wonderful thing to do? You can tell there's something coming up which is going to be a bit not quite as wonderful as we first thought. Okay. But it was a pretty obvious path to go down. And indeed, within a few years, a very short space of time, a number of COX-2 selective inhibitors were identified. So we had celecoxib and rofecoxib were the two ones that came along first. And they were shown to be as effective as the other NSAIDs. So diclofenac was used for treating arthritis and still is used. And celecoxib and rofecoxib were just as good as diclofenac at treating the inflammation and the pain. And as you would predict, the risk of these serious upper gastrointestinal events, so the risk of stomach bleeding, was very, very much less in the celecoxib compared to the ordinary NSAIDs. So celecoxib and another one, etoricoxib, were licensed for relief of osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. What's handy about drugs that have been identified relatively recently is that the last part of their name is consistent. Okay, so these are all the coxibs. So if you ever see the term coxib, that's the overarching name for the COX-2 inhibitors. Lumiracoxib was also licensed for osteoarthritis and moderate to severe pain. So this was a pretty new avenue, a pretty new way of tackling pain and inflammation. So what went wrong? Well, what went wrong was that after a long period of time, well, actually it wasn't that long. I can't remember how long they'd been on the market for, but the drugs had got all the way through the clinical trials and they'd got onto the market. And then it was identified that a small number of people showed very serious cardiovascular side effects. And that resulted in this recommendation. This is the Committee for the Safety of Medicines in the US. And it said that because of these cardiovascular side effects, the COX-IBs should be used in preference to the non-selective drugs only when specifically indicated. So for patients who are at particularly high risk of developing a gastric ulcer or bleeding, and after they've been assessed for cardiovascular risk. So there was a big warning that was put out. Furthermore, it says the Committee for the Safety of Medicines has advised that patients who have ischemic heart disease or cerebrovascular disease should not be given these drugs. It was a really difficult time because you had patients with arthritis who'd had crippling pain and inflammation, who'd been given these drugs and found they were wonderful. And to be honest, a lot of them just, if you told them, well, you might be at greater risk of heart attack, they would just say, I don't care, I want the drug. But at the time, there was a big media fuss about the fact that a number of people had died of heart attacks. So it was a pretty serious side effect. And there was a lot of discussion about why it should be and how it might happen, and the fact that these drugs got all the way through the clinical trials without this problem being detected. I think, in all fairness to the drug companies, the number of patients you'd have to test in order to find this effect is very large. So you could argue that it's possible that they could have gone all the way through to the end of the clinical trial without that side effect being detected. There was also the allegation of the drug companies covering up negative results or bad results. I don't really want to go there because I want to keep this to a nice discussion of the molecular mechanisms. I just thought I'd raise that.